Okay, I'll just talk to you about the case study presentation on the Crow's Nest project. Obviously, you heard Joe already sort of give you a bit of his experience and journey in this project. Okay, so we've circulated some materials about the case study. It's, you've got the original construction certificate, the modified construction certificate, the contracts, and the professional indemnity insurance, as well as the written directions notice. Okay, so the reason we got interested in this particular project is because we became aware recently of a number of damage happening to properties next to multi-unit residential developments. These instances have shown a light on systemic weaknesses that have contributed to these events. And we're following a number of projects, of these types of projects. And we just wanted to share with you our learning experience. So how did a construction site go from this to this, where, if you all see that, where it's called significant damage to the adjacent property. As you can see from the images, it's pretty extensive. I'll just really briefly sort of highlight the chronology. So the original construction certificate was issued on the 10th of December 2020. In approximately 6 weeks or so, the wall collapsed in the adjacent building, which then led to a stop work order while the authorities went in and had a look at what happened and made the site safe. Joe has already highlighted some of his experience where there had to be a number of interactions with various authorities, which then took up to 3 months before they got a modified construction certificate and the work could restart. So, our first site visit, we encountered a site that looks like this. Clearly there had been further demolition work carried out on the adjacent building, obviously to make it safe. So this is the first time we actually had a look at the site, spoke to the builder, and just sort of got a handle of what we were encountering. A second site visit, the site looked like this. No work was being done, and there were other issues that also were raised, including the instability of the ground below the footpath under the hoarding. You can see that in the images. In this case, it was good to see the certifier stepping up and taking a more proactive role, and where a written directions notice was issued. Clearly, it identified the non-compliance, then set out the steps that needs to be taken to rectify the non-compliance and by what date. So this is like really positive to see where the certifier is actually, stepping up and actually taking a more proactive role. I think Joe has alluded to this, where through this entire period, we've worked collaboratively with the various parties. You can see we met with the developer, the engineer, both the previous and the current engineers. We met with obviously the builder and the certifier, as well as North Sydney Council, to identify what are the formalities that is required to be completed to resolve and to be resolved and get the work started. So it was, even though it was a long process, we did work collaboratively, getting regular updates. So some of the work that was required, some of the things that were required to get the work started, and this is just some of them, it's not an exhaustive list, was getting a geotechnical report and certificate, getting the engineer's report and certificate, obviously providing, and also, obviously interactions with North Sydney Council, which then led to getting a building information certificate, ensuring that the work didn't need to be demolished. And Safe Work obviously had removed a stop work order, which then finally the certifier was able to issue a modified construction certificate once they got the updated plans from the engineer. So I mean, I guess this highlights, the impact of not doing it right. This meant work had stopped for more than 3 months, while the developer, builder, and engineer had to comply with the various formalities as required by the Office of Building Commissioner, Safe Work, the certifier, and North Sydney Council. So work commenced on the 15th of May, I think. 17th, close. And we're obviously, as I said, we're following this project, so we went back a couple of weeks later, and this is what we found, which was, we thought, a noticeable positive difference. Work had commenced, and we're assured, we feel confident that going forward that all the requirements will be followed by this team. Obviously heard Joe's partner.
So my name is Joseph Shahady, Senior Project Manager for a company called JD Projects Group. I was very humbled and honoured when Mr. David Chandler asked me to come in and present to everyone today. I received a phone call that no one really wants to receive as a project manager when you have an incident on the project, which happened late January this year. We adjacent building, we were working right beside an office block, and we were doing some piling, some groundworks, and we had a partial collapse of a building next door. I must say it was a very trying time. The team got through it and went through some immense and difficult times, but we came out of it much better people. I got to meet some fantastic people along the way, and I'm standing here in front of you all. My parents would be so proud. I'm back at university, so it's fantastic. In relation to the incident itself, I am immensely grateful that nobody was harmed. That's the main thing from my point of view, a team's point of view, and something that I think it was a blessing from above. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I would also that everybody appreciates that it's still an ongoing investigation. There's insurance companies involved, there's legal representatives, and I'm sure you all appreciate that I can't dive too much into the incident itself, but really what I can talk about is coming out the other side. As a senior manager, we've worked hard, head down, backside up, to get back on site, and that was a massive process, and it was a huge learning curve, not just for myself, but for everybody involved. So I have a very big thank you to say about everyone involved in that as well. After the collapse, I was posed this question, basically was, what's your first thought on this experience? And without hesitation, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, to be honest. But in saying that, there's a massive positive to come out of a negative. I must admit there were some very challenging times through the process and to working towards getting back on site. Keeping the team motivated was huge for me as a senior project manager. There were some times where you keep finding the light towards the end of the tunnel, and then it just keeps closing back on you. There's so many things, and there's so many new legislations, or so many legislations that we wanted to tick the box for, but at the same time, it wasn't going to be just, here's the gates and we can walk straight in. And that was a massive learning experience for us, and I'm very grateful for it. For me, the approach was quite simple. Stay positive, always take a calm, patient and respectful approach, and lastly, respect the process. The process was going to take some time, and I understood that, and it was difficult for me to get that over to the team, but eventually we got there, we found a way. A few of the challenges we encountered along the way was, after the event, we just had some biblical rain. It rained for months on end. So this was January. In February we occurred a lot of rain. As you can appreciate, the site lay dormant for a long time. We had surrounding paths, we had undermining issues, we had issues with Safe Work New South Wales to give us access to make the place safe. So there was so much hurdles we had to cross. And we finally got there, which was great. So there was no more incidents or any safety to the undue safety to the challenges to the public. Furthermore, we had to test the integrity of all the completed piles. So basically, we got to the stage where the piles were complete, and we were starting to do a capping beam, and then obviously the incident occurred, and we needed to do some testing, some integrity testing to the piles. So there was a few parameters there we had to come across, which we worked very closely with our engineers, Xavier Knight, to do all those, and I'm sure they'll bring you up to speed with all that once we get the slides up. Satisfying all requirements and conditions handed down by our PCA. So as you can appreciate, an incident occurred and we had a stop work notice put on the project. That was put in place from our PCA, AED, who apologises they can't be here today. So we had to satisfy all those requirements. And lastly, there was a huge collaboration between everyone involved. So myself, my team, our engineers, our client, trying to keep the client positive. You know, there's a lot of money involved. Time is money as well, and keeping everybody positive through that process and understanding we'll be back on site soon. Lastly, I also wanted to mention there's all the parameters with council, DA's wording of documentation. I do really want to say a thank you to Mr. David Chandler as well. The final piece of the puzzle was getting council and getting all of us together in a room, nutting all the last issues out, and that helped us get back on site. From the incident to where we stand today, there was a gap of about 3 months to get all the documentation back up to speed. We had a new design put in place. We also had a new development CC that had to be put in place, and then the CC needed to be satisfied, obviously, as you can appreciate, before we can get back on site and work on site. So it was a huge team effort, and it was a huge learning experience, and thank you so much for putting up with me, but for listening to everything that I had to say. And I'll pass you on to Ferris, our engineer, and we'll also run through the modules on site. Thank you, guys.
Before I begin, in any case, I just want to explain my first interaction with David Chandler. Xavier Knight was recently appointed to the project after the collapse had occurred, to take over and so on. And we were invited by JD, our new clients, which was the builder, to meet with David Chandler at the time on site, maybe 7 o'clock in the morning. And geez, did he come down like a hurricane. He was very stern, he was very concerned, and I'm trying to use good words. No, I'm only joking, but and rightfully so. And it was kind of, it was a bit shocking to me. I never had really been put in that position, and I'm sure, as Joe attested to as well, he hadn't either. And as the project progressed, we all were a little bit concerned about the strict nature of David Chandler and what he may or may not ask us to do, and how long he may close this project for. But I'd like to say, and I'm mentioning this, I'd like to say on the flip side is that throughout this process, we took a collaborative approach with David. We maintained consistent communication with him to the point where we all agreed, yes, it's been some point down the track, we have to meet with David in his office, we have to grab the builder, we have to grab the developer, we have to go and initiate this meeting. And we did that. And it was actually a little bit surprising at the time, because once David had reflected the good work that we were doing to get this project back on track, he was like a bull in terms of getting the stop work removed and getting us to start work back on site. So it was eye-opening that, although I believe David's out there doing amazing work and actually putting the fear of God into the builders, In fact, when you're approaching your work in the right way, when you're, when you have the right mindset, he'll be your biggest supporter. And that's what I learned personally. So I'm sorry, David, if I'm stepping out of line, but I just wanted to say that. And he became the project's biggest supporter. And, he roused on a number of individuals in that room saying, we better get this on track, we better get this CC happening, we're going to start work on Monday. And it was just amazing to see. So thanks, David. That was an amazing experience we had with you throughout this journey.
Thank you.
This was the introduction. I think Joe had mentioned. It was Joe, Shahidi, myself, and Jason Storer, who's not here today. My surname, and we're not related in any way. Actually, we met for the very first time on this project, believe it or not.
Each other from Baraso
Yeah.
for this project.
So, but we're best buddies now. So, Joe, did you want to reiterate anything before I start back on the
I can quickly just go through
construction?
the original challenges. So,
Yeah.
sorry, I just jumped in. It was just an unsettling pause, so I just thought I'd start, guys. But I did run through the challenges. So, early challenges was the stability around the site, utilising the existing piling system, updating all the project documentation, maintaining our client relationship, which was very huge for us. It was very difficult to catch up with them every fortnight and say the same thing over and over again when they're walking into a job site where absolutely nothing's happening. And you can feel the frustration building and building. And as a project manager, you start running out of things to say. So for us, it was very critical. We really needed to get back on this job site. And yeah, thank you to David again. And obviously removing the stop work order that was in place. So our solutions, as previously mentioned as well, shotcrete design and approval for the stability of all the undermining. Investigative works were carried out to all the piles and the pile integrity. Ferris will run you through all of that in due course. Constant design meetings held by us, the builder, the structural engineers, our services engineers. Weekly updates with our client. So I was sending them an update every week as to what was happening, paperwork, collaborations, documentation, reports, certificates. I was doing that on a weekly basis. This project really needed some positive vibes, and sending them all this information, keeping them up to speed of what was happening was really critical, I found, during this process. And obviously lastly was the collaboration with the structural engineers, the geotechs, the PCA, and lastly, as mentioned, Mr. David Chandler. As you can see, there's some photos there of the stabilisation work, shotcreting methods all the way around the perimeter, some soil nails, as you can see through here, and then some mesh reinforcement as per the designs. Next one, please, Ferris, if you don't mind. And then the pile integrity testing. So we did two forms. Ferris will bring you up to speed with the types. So there was pile integrity testing by coring through the piles, and then also there was, I think that's sonar testing as well, for us to be confident that the structural adequacy moving forward, the piles were very capable of taking all the loads. And then, yeah, moving on to Ferris.
So I'll jump in and take it from here. I will try to keep it a little bit lighthearted on the technical side, although perhaps after in our workshops we can talk more about the technical nature of the project. And also I'll minimise my speculation about what had happened prior to our engagement. But nonetheless, I think it's probably fitting to start, and what I'll do right now is just take you through the process of our initial engagement and helping the project get back off the ground. But that being said, it's very important to understand what the role of engineers / designers role in society is. And we have to create safe, serviceable, sustainable buildings, and sustainability is, we shouldn't just use it as a buzzword, but it's very important and actually defines us, defines the caliber of the engineer. The other thing is that, you know, being part of a design team, we're potentially responsible for all the creations in the built environment, from the conceptualization, from the planning, from the monitoring, from the inspections, from the commissioning. So we have a very significant role in the design of buildings, the construction of buildings, and their commissioning and the life of their building. So for any particular designer, I believe this is the mindset which you have to come into a project, any project, in understanding what your responsibility is. And it's more to us than just designing a beam and a column and there she goes. So it's very important to understand the philosophy of what you're doing on any particular project. We were engaged on the project to take over the project holistically, and our first aim and the highest priority was lifting the stop work order. The developer, the builders, God only knows what type of monetary loss is happening during this period of time, and providing our expertise to ensure that the swift progression of this project was of the utmost importance. In order to understand what we truly needed to provide to lift the stop work order, we all must understand what the stakeholders of the project are. You can see their community, very important, and you can see there, the asset holders next door. Abiding by standards, regulations, guidelines, and so on and so forth, local council, developers and builders. Any particular designer needs to have all the stakeholders of the project in mind going into the design. Now, again, this is the very basic concept of how we approach the design, and there are many other facets of conducting your design, including adherence to codes and legislation and so on and so forth. But the very basic things that I'd like to bring to your attention, and potentially it's overlooked by designers, is something as simple as this: understanding the context of the project. Identifying the risks and opportunities of the project before you just begin. Okay, so they're the fundamental things that should happen in every designer's mind when they're approaching the design. Now, point number 3 is more specific to this project, in which what we had conducted was assessing the condition and the form of the as-built piles and shoring wall. There was speculation from the prior consultant, prior engineer, that the piles were not built in accordance with the drawings. And this was going to be a major drawback in moving the project forward. So how are we going to deal with this? So, you know, there was actually speculation before we arrived that Joe would have to now demolish 50, 60 piles in the ground, and God knows how he was going to re-erect them. So all these fanciful things that were discussed prior to our engagement. So it was very important to assess the condition and the form of the as-built piles and the shoring wall, so we can effectively move forward with this project. And finally, completing the circle, making sure our designs comply with all stakeholder requirements. So I'll take you through a little bit closer into all of those. As you can see here, the project, this is the site here. It's bounded by 3 streets: Alexander, Devonshire, and Alexandria Lane. This particular property, so this is actually probably pre-demolition, but this is unfortunately the property which was affected by the works conducted at the time prior to our engagement. And at the moment, you would see that the building adjacent has probably lost the first structural bay. So as a result of the collapse of the facade and or temporary stabilisation methods, this building was demolished closer to the first internal row of columns. You can see the properties around the site. They are a certain distance away, potentially in engineering terms outside of the zone of influence. However, this particular these particular residents are very close as well, so that was also subject of our analysis in point 4 in the prior, to ensure that all the stakeholder requirements are met. So that's the now the very first point which I mentioned before in the design process is understanding the context. So us as designers, we're all very learned people in here, but this is a trap for young players where every engineer thinks, okay, they should design a beam, or they should design a column, or they should design something. But really, it's what the input, it's the context at which the design surrounds itself is the most important. So for us, understanding how to design this building, we have to understand the geology. We have to understand Mother Nature, the forces of which is wind and earthquake and many other things. The site surrounds, as I had discussed. the context is about what type of buildings are around us, what type of condition are they in, and potentially what type of movement or influence can they withstand whilst maintaining their structural integrity. The other things that we have to understand is architectural design intent, facade, and client and authority requirements. So these are all very basic things, however potentially overlooked when designers are moving through the design process. Risk and opportunities. So like David, I've copied and pasted someone else's chart about risk and opportunities, but it's actually very, very close to what we do. And the risks and opportunities, so what we need to do is a thorough evaluation of those risks and opportunities inherent in the project. And as per the standard measure, you evaluate the likelihood of an event occurring to the potential consequence of it occurring, and you as a professional, whether it's either defined in legislation or you as a professional, make a decision of what type of risk that you should or should not accept. Okay, so this is also very fundamental to when we're starting the project. When we're developing our solutions, we have to go through this process to understand. So as a concept, this needs to be applied. With respect to the project specifically, I put up a bulk excavation plan which shows the shoring wall and capping beam and some of the context in which is around the site. You can see the risks inherent in this particular project was determined by the undermining and destabilisation of the adjacent structures. That's actually very pertinent to the overall discussion of this, but shoring, excavation, collapse due to inadequate design and support, the presence of existing services and damage to them, the presence of adjacent infrastructure and property and damage to them, and obviously during construction as well, injury due to noise, vibration, dust, flying debris, and so on and so forth. So that was a very careful assessment that would guide us to understanding what is the appropriate solution for the project moving forward, and also to give all the stakeholders comfort that these things have been reviewed and that they've been analysed and evaluated to be acceptable moving forward. The third part of the design process, and again I'm just focusing on the design process to help these guys get out of the ground and start moving on the project, is the assessment and the condition, of the condition and the form of the as-built piles. So it was our aim, it was our intention to truly understand what was built, so we could make a valid decision that if we should keep what was built and incorporate that into the structure, if remedial work was to be required, or a complete demolition. Now obviously, in anyone's book, and for us to be the designers we think we are and say we are, we wanted to prove that what was constructed was adequate, and if it wasn't adequate, then we would deal with it. So some of the information that we had collected to survey or to evaluate the condition of the as-built piles was, we requested the following: as-built survey of the structure, which is of the piled wall that was installed, pile installation logs, reinforcement schedules, this is just an excerpt of it, concrete test reports, an excerpt of a concrete test report, geotechnical inspection certificates carried out at the time at which the piling was undertaken, and we also asked for third-party geotechnical assessment which would validate the geotechnical inspections that had occurred before against the host of information that was present. So you can see this is almost a collection of evidence of what had occurred. And I remember having a discussion with David once, and he almost mentioned that, is this really occurring, even though this did not happen? In your day-to-day design, us as engineers, communicating with the developers, are you receiving this information? Are you requesting that information? Because in fact, this is very important, not only pertinent to this situation of which a collapse had occurred, but in an everyday transaction as an engineer and a builder, we are not only to inspect what is visual and in front of us, but we are to understand and collect the information which we cannot see. And both of those two together helps us be able to certify the structure. So you can see an extensive collection of information and evaluation of that information had occurred. The next step was within the assessment phase was really understanding the condition of the pile. So it's one thing to have it on paper and we can see photos and we can see reinforcement and cages and the concrete strength at 28 days and so on and so forth, and that was all sweet. But realistically, and this was the first question David asked me, he said, well, mate, how do you know the quality of these piles? You weren't there, you didn't see it, how are you going to certify these? That was a bit of a challenge in itself, a bit confronting, but nonetheless I assured him that there were techniques that we would be able to employ that would be able to give us an indication of the structural integrity of each of those piles. Now, not to go too deep in the code, you know, there's all sorts of geotechnical risk reduction factors and so on associated with integrity, testing a certain percentage of piles in the ground. The minimum, I think, is about 5%. We took a sample of 50% of the piles. And we started with the critical piles, the piles that were load bearing, the piles that were receiving the greatest lateral loads. And we started with there. And we started with the first sample of 10. We assessed that. And after the first sample of 10, we wanted to take a probabilities type of approach and say, okay, well, if there's nothing and if everything is good, let's just leave it alone. But I think with this respect and this particular project, we didn't take that chance. We took the next sample, and we took the next sample of 10. And throughout all of this testing, we did identify one pile that potentially had an issue. And what we decided to do in a two-pronged approach is use destructive testing, or pretty much coring of the pile all the way down to the base of the pile to extract the result of that defective pile, and also take two other cores within the sample of the other piles to ensure that what we're seeing, which is, this is a graph, and I actually don't exactly know what it is, but I'm sure it's a pulse and an acceleration, and it travels down the pile and it comes back up, and reading through these graphs, it tells you if there's any anomalies and so on and so forth, and in which the experts who conducted this as well took two physical core samples to also verify what the graphs were telling us was in fact physically observed through destructive testing. So all of that was occurred, and finally we determined that we understood the form and the condition of of a very strong sample of the shoring wall, and where one was observed to be defective, we addressed that specifically in the design moving forward. Okay, so this is actually just a table out of the pile integrity testing report, which was received, and there's a number of grades which decide the structural integrity of the pile, and all of the piles but one achieved the B or better rating, which is actually a very strong indication that the condition of the piles, the integrity of the piles were acceptable. Moving forward, and I'll try not to be too long now, but you can see the site potentially in its current form, or maybe not actually. This is geotech, so you can't actually see the adjacent building demolished in this. But what's very important, and I'm cycling back, is making sure the design is sensitive to all the stakeholder requirements. Now, I can assure you there's some young players as engineers who truly don't understand what is happening on the site and how does that influence. And it's not only how does that influence, this house next door is not just a house. It has a particular structure, it has a particular condition at the moment. This needs to be understood. Part of the way we understand that, if there's designers the engineers in the room, is the fact that we conduct dilapidation reports of all the infrastructure around us and of the surrounding property. I see sometimes those reports are given to the builder and chucked in the bottom drawer. In fact, it's actually a designer's tool to understand how this may influence each other. So, nonetheless, we understood that there was already a failure of the adjacent building, and we wanted to make sure, as a standard due course, that the surrounding public and the infrastructure would also be protected and their structural integrity maintained. In order to do that, we requested the help of a geotech engineer to conduct a numeric analysis, whether it's a quasi-finite element type analysis or a spring stiffness type analysis. It's the FLAC, which geotechs use, and in doing so, they modelled the stiffness of our structure, they modelled the geology and the load conditions around, and they reported back to us what type of displacements that they thought would occur to the adjacent buildings and properties. And you can see there's some technical numbers in terms of vertical displacements, lateral displacements, and distortion or rotation, angular rotation of the footings adjacent to the building. We use certain literatures and guides and so on and so forth to determine if they're acceptable or not, and thanks be to God that they were acceptable. In my closing statement, in any case, we've talked a lot about design, but Yolanda actually talked about something as just as significant, and it's the combination of good design and construction phase verification and support. They go hand in hand. When you collaborate with the builder, you collaborate with the developer, you collaborate with the stakeholders, you get the successful project. So I think it's tying up of great designs and great supervision on site. And if there's any engineers out there on site as well, yes, we were part of a situation where we said to the builders, well, we think we should do 30 inspections. They came back to us and said, you know what, we only want you to do 15, we're only going to pay you for 15. You know, and in hindsight, I think that's not acceptable. Not acceptable on our accord, and we should have just stood our ground and say, you know what, mate, if you want to put numbers to it, let's not put numbers. This is my inspection rate, this is my per inspection. I am required, in accordance with the legislation and the new Design Building Practitioners Act, to inspect every element of this building. So however many inspections that takes, thank you, Mr. Builder, that's what you're going to have to pay for. So I think for us that was even though we weren't involved in the initial collapse, it was a lesson learned in a matter of course.
Absolutely. And moving forward, that was the agreement. Whatever inspections were required, as per Xavier Knight's brief, we would be paying for. It wasn't a matter of, no, we're only paying for this. Whatever is the ultimate guide and requirement, we will be doing. Just quickly, I know unfortunately Jason's not with us, the PCA. There was one significant thing that Yolanda did mention, and she did mention something called a Building Information Certificate. I do want to ask a question. Does anyone know has anyone come across a Building Information Certificate? Do they know what it is? And honestly, I'd really like to know, put hands up, who's heard of a Building Information Certificate? So what, 1, 2, 3, 4. Out of how many people here? Okay. I learned that lesson with Mr. David Chandler too. I was one of those people that had no idea about a Building Information Certificate. Just a bit of background on that and on this project. So when we were doing the piles, the piling rig could not get into the corner of the site to get the pile in the position that it was documented. We sent information and requested that the pile be relocated in a position where the machine could fit, which was 400 millimeters off where it was supposed to be. Hence, a Building Information Certificate was required, which is a form that we need to fill out, submitting to council, informing them of the change of design in the project. We had a meeting at the end of the project with council, and his response to us was, surely you don't need it if you're only shifting it a few hundred millimeters, but you do. So for me, what I'm trying to say is that, yes, I've been in the game for 20 years, I'm learning every single day, and a Building Information Certificate was one of those things that I first learned from Mr. Chandler. Does anyone have any questions to ask?
No, just make one comment and a question. I want to acknowledge the fact that you shared to come here in such an open way and share this experience, because I think the message you're giving to everybody is this is not an experience that you should have. I'd like to call out Jason Storer, because Jason's got a bit of history with us and at the Office of Fair Trading, but on this job I have to say, he stood up, he displayed every competency that I would expect a certifier to have. His knowledge of the Building Code of Australia, his knowledge of the processes as being a certifier shone from the beginning to the start as far as I'm concerned. And I'd want to acknowledge Jason's contribution on this job as being absolutely a benchmark that everyone should try and emulate. And finally, it's good just to remind you that you've only got a CC to the street level.
That's correct. Thanks, everyone.
In layman's terms, why did the collapse happen?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I can't divulge any information because I don't know it, but it's all in the investigation. It's all in the investigators' hands at the moment.
Of course I have an opinion, but I don't.
Everyone has an
I'm not allowed to, I don't think I'm allowed to share it
Yeah.
because it's an ongoing investigation.
Any questions? Any other questions?
Just like for me, I'm an architect, so dealing with fees and just sort of how did maybe it's a bit obvious how the engineer was around fees, why he didn't do the inspection. Like there was a reduction in his fees.
No, I can't say there was.
Could you restate the question, please? It's hard to hear.
Just asking if there was a reduction in fees.
Was there a reduction in fees with the engineer? Is that why he didn't come and inspect?
The original.
The original engineer. I don't want to throw people under the bus because there's a lot of speculation, but sometimes you ask someone to do something, they tell you, send me this. And I'll just leave it at that, to be honest. But no, there definitely was not a reduction in fees. Anyone else? Yep.
Were they taking pre-contract?
Was, to be honest with you, the documentation was at 90%, 95%. Yolanda made a comment about novated contracts. There was absolutely no novated contracts on this project from insurance purposes. Obviously, if there was going to be that moving forward, we'd have to obviously update our policy, but there was definitely no novated contracts on this project. It was all D&C, any person or any contract or any consultant that we brought on board was brought on board with a brand new consultancy agreement with new fees.
Just last question.
Sorry.
So-
Yep.
Sorry.
No.
What was the building before this new building? Did you have to dig deeper into for basement car park or something? Like the new construction?
The new construction?
So what was the
It's a-
change between the existing condition
Yep.
and the new?
So the existing building there was no basement. So
Okay.
it was just a two-story walk-up,
Yeah.
which was demolished to ground level. And the building next door was the same, two-story walk-up, demolished to ground level. So we're going 2 stories down now into a basement.
Two-story.
Yeah,
So
two-story.
what was the onset of the failure? Was it just after you started being?
Oh, we hadn't started bulk excavation at all.
No, so it was just the removal of the old building. and
Removal
that's
of old
when the-
building and piles were installed, that's it.
And that's when that was the onset of the.
That was one
failure.
set of possible, yeah, possible. Sorry, yeah.
You mentioned that you demolished the first bay. Have you had to build the wall again before you bring all those piles? So I imagine that the building that collapsed already, or whatever, I don't know how old that building is. That wall possibly is part of the lateral stability of the building. Is it built or is it just assuming it's vacant and?
I believe by just reading it was a very basic report by another engineer. Xavier Knight did not review the stability but relied upon someone else's report. So it was confirmed by other parties that that building in its decommissioned state, in its currently dilapidated, cut back state, is stable. And
Yeah, so part of the process of being able to get back on site, so insurances got involved, there had to be make safe to the building next door. So obviously there was a much more of a demolition to the neighbouring building to get it to a position where it was made safe, and then ongoing investigations. Any other questions? So,
You have incited on the challenges regarding.
So-
You have mentioned the challenges regarding design, construction.
Yep.
But what about, especially there is some existing building. What about operation for facility management, the documentation for that stage and the post-construction?
post-construction
Exactly.
stages.
Yeah, because most of the challenges here, you mentioned regarding the design and construction.
Yep.
So what about the post-construction?
Post-construction challenges. I did mention the client, keeping them happy. That was Oh, that was immense. Honestly, every second Tuesday, I hated my life.
So when you met the client,
Yeah.
for example, the asset information requirement from the client has been defined, or clear for you, you work based on that?
Look, the clear indication from look, I must say, we were very lucky to have a calm, calculated client. They knew the situation. There was no point in coming there and beating your chest and, you know, making all this unnecessary noise. They worked very, very collaboratively with us to get the project back on track. We did hear a few times from the banks. The banks were a little bit concerned. Obviously, everybody's taken out loans, so on and so forth. Interest payments, the client was starting to get a little bit nervous, to be honest. But they could really see the work that was going on in the background from the team to get back on site. We were not sitting on our hands. We were doing everything we possibly could without cutting any corners to get back on site. And that was the big ticket thing for us, was making sure we don't cut corners. Yes, we know it was going to take time. Let's make sure we work within the parameters and get there as quick as we possibly could. Anyone, any other?
Yeah, just quickly, you're relying on third-party inspections a lot by the sound of things for your piles, but what other self-certifications or quality control mechanisms did you have in place to get satisfaction of a builder that it's time to get that inspection done?
It was almost a suggestion to the builder.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
it
look,
an
for
engineering
us,
question
I
or
think
an
we're
engineering
starting
question?
to talk about trustworthiness, right?
Yep.
And that's important, and David made a comment to the engineer around having some provenance of artefacts that you can rely on to help for your inspection beyond those visual things. So what other artefacts did you actually have to support your inspection before calling the engineer to do their inspection? Was there a bit of a chain of material there, I guess is the question?
I mean, the usual strategy for piling is you got to get all your reinforcement logs, you get all your concrete logs, all your concrete testing.
Yep.
You get your geotechnical testing before you pour your piles. And then once you've poured your piles, you obviously do your slump tests and so on and so forth from your suppliers. From the engineering point of view, they obviously do a visual inspection prior and after. But the main thing that Ferris focused on also was the material, the supply of material, ensuring that the material that was supplied was as per the documentation, as per the specifications. So yeah, that's the only things that I would think that you require documentation.
Yolanda mentioned before, maybe it's just trying to tie into what you're suggesting, is that potentially in a good collaboration, the engineer should request from the builder the construction sequence / methodology. We need to know that in any case to understand how they're going to sequence the construction, where are the construction joints, where are the temporary penetrations, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in an ideal world, we'd like to rely on a builder to say, here you go, engineer, this is your engagement, and these are all the documents that you require to do your work. But yes, it's a two-way street, so if we don't have that information, we've got to be requesting that information. So understanding that information will also inform us as to potentially how many inspections are required for the project. And the other thing is as well is sometimes the construction methodology of which is happening potentially is outside the technical expertise of a builder. I mean, the builder should be, I believe, should be across everything, but sometimes it's beyond that. But that's when I think the builder should also rely on the competence of the engineer to provide specifications and ITPs to let them know when is the appropriate time for an engineer to inspect that particular element. And yeah, I agree as well. Some builders are actually not privy to reading the specification, reading the note sheet, reading the ITPs. It's amazing, and it doesn't happen. But it's a very important point moving forward.
We're going to step in, and I'm sure that you can have a cup of coffee outside and ask all the penetrating questions you like, but if the key message here is, here's an experience of one player, at any time we've got 350 strata construction buildings under construction in New South Wales at any one time. I look around at many of them and think, there but for the grace of God goes another catastrophe. I mean that, there but for the grace of God. So at any time we've got 350 buildings in New South Wales within 6 months of being complete It's currently running at about 700 buildings, strata buildings being complete in New South Wales each year. So the message here is, look, there'll be things that you reflect on that you won't ever do again, and there'll be things you reflect on that you'll always do in the future. I think one of the things that we'll be really pressing for is better record keeping. So James, you're aware that, you know, we've got a big push on for better record keeping. It's terribly important that everybody keeps records. So you've got something to look at and go back to, because that's been a big hole for certifiers. They haven't kept the records. Going to projects where, on that 300 bathroom project at Botany, the certifier said, I've done the minimum inspections of the wet areas. I said, good, tell me which ones you went to, and he said, I didn't keep a record. So I said, well, that's good. So we'll go back and start destructive testing, and we'll satisfy ourselves when we stop that testing. It's about record keeping. It's about waking up the slumber of this industry where everybody thinks that they're just a bit better than that person. We want them to be aiming to be as good as that person. I think if you follow these guys around now, you want to be watching them, because they're aiming to be that person, not saying, but we're a bit better than that person. So it's a slumber time wake up, everybody can improve, so you could put these guys on the toast for another hour and a half and it wouldn't make you any better. They're already there, so they don't need to be on more toast. Just don't get on more toast yourself. So let me thank you both for coming in.
Pleasure, thanks
It was
for
great.
having
Well done.